James is initially intrigued when he finds a weird structure in the middle of the woods. It didn't have windows or doors. He made a valiant effort to sneak a peek inside the structure to observe what was happening within. But soon after, he departs as quickly as he could. He calls the police for assistance once he is a safe distance away. James had been hiking for approximately 2 hours in the quiet forest. He noticed something between the trees in the distance. Something like that shouldn't be so distant from civilization and so deep in the forest. But it aroused James' interest. He discovered that the structure was some sort of stone house when he drew nearer. However, he couldn't help but feel that this was most likely one of the oddest houses he had ever seen. James was largely surprised by the building's position and excellent condition. It was only marginally weakened by the forces of nature. The house didn't appear to be very old either. Although the architectural design was somewhat traditional, the materials could be found in any modern home. But it was nothing compared to what was most startling about the building. James swiftly circled the structure, but he couldn't see any entrance. There were no windows or doors, but on the upper floor was a large opening, and it was protected by what appeared to be iron bars. Why would someone construct a house that you couldn't enter? What could this building possibly be used for in the heart of the forest? James had a lot of questions. He tried to peer through the sizable gap he believed to be at the building's front. It wasn't easy as it was in the second story. He didn't have the power in his arms to raise himself that high. James, however, had no intention of leaving this spot without discovering the truth. He searched for something to use to climb up to the window. The wood he found around was weak and unable to sustain his weight, but the forest was around him, and James knew it was his only chance to get a glance inside the weird edifice. He didn't want to harm or kill healthy portions of the environment. It was difficult to cut a branch that was thick and sturdy enough to hold his weight with his Swiss Army knife. He took all necessary precautions so that when he put weight on the branch, it wouldn't move under his feet. When everything was ready, James carefully began the climb. James could see inside the building. He struggled to understand what he was seeing. There were machines inside and James was unsure of their function. "What do you think you're doing here?" Someone yelled from within the building. Immediately, James lost his balance and fell off the branch. He took a severe fall, but when he began to hear frantic sounds coming from inside the house, his adrenaline took over. He stood up as quickly as he could and fled the premises. Although he didn't know how someone could enter or leave this property, he wasn't going to hang around to find out. When he was a safe distance away where he could still see the building, he called the police. The police didn't believe what James was saying. But when James shared pictures and his location with officers, they knew he wasn't lying. They sent some cops to the scene to explore it. The police realized there was no easy route to reach James. If they followed his route, they would have to walk at least 3 hours, and if they drove, it would take them a whole day. There simply wasn't any other option. These two options were out of the question. Fortunately, 5 cops went with the helicopter. James made it sound urgent, and they arrived in 15 minutes. The helicopter flew as high as possible to avoid being spotted by curious civilians or possible fugitives. No one could see the unusual house that James had described over the phone, but they were all entranced by the grandeur of the trees as they peered down. When they saw the house, they jumped out of the helicopter. As soon as the last officer jumped onto the stony terrain, the pilot headed back to base but remained available in case of an emergency. The commander paid attention to James and tried to understand his muddled speech. James was taken aback by what he believed to have been inside the building's walls. James told the commander that he had been watching the house and the person he saw was still there. He suggested that they enter through the roof. Everyone's positions were swiftly given by the commander. James silently observed the scene as the police officers worked to secure their positions. The more he observed the situation, the more hoped not to be in the wrong. James' wish seems to have come true. The authorities were forced to acknowledge that James was not exaggerating or lying. There was a lot of machinery inside, but no one in sight. James waited for the same sound that earlier had thrown him off balance. But instead, the police officers were met by stillness. The officers exchanged a look of awe. They knew the assailant James described had vanished. This was the perfect moment to storm the building. They had no other choice. The officers assisted one another in climbing through the window one at a time. Although the goal was to prevent bloodshed, the officers were armed and cautious. The unusually cool temperature in the building was the first thing the police noticed. The interior of the house's modern design was the second. It was a sharp departure from what they anticipated. In search of the source of the cool air, the officers moved through the apartment. They found a powerful air conditioner, but this simply prompted additional questions. Officials questioned how electricity reached such a distant area of the forest. They also wondered how the man James had seen earlier in the day was able to gain entrance into the building. The entire space was deserted. Perhaps he had left the structure before the cops arrived. As they observed further items in the building, the police exchanged knowing glances. They were certain something illegal had been taking place within the building. The commander requested that experts come and investigate the crime site. They wanted answers. Before a specialist could arrive, it would be several hours, allowing the criminals plenty of time to flee. They were about to give up when they heard a huge explosion come from a corner. A trapdoor had caused one of the officers to trip over it. Two cops entered the trapdoor swiftly to learn more and reported that the trail appeared to go on forever. They had uncovered the exit. The commander felt content that they could solve the case. They all had the same idea. If they moved quickly, they might be able to apprehend the suspects. The police picked up their pace and arrived at the end of the tunnel. A ramp led into a related structure that was connected by a second trapdoor. They weren't expecting a light at the end of the tunnel. They would need to come up with a strategy. Then they heard movement behind the door and contemplated their next move. They couldn't let this chance go away. The four officers went silently around the entrance with their guns drawn while they listened. There was activity. Fortunately, the door was unlocked while someone was moving objects underneath them. They rushed down the trapdoor screaming for everyone nearby to freeze. The officers aimed their guns at their target. It was a man, and he had a horrific expression. He had just finished loading a truck. He hung his head and lifted his hands. The handcuffs snapped shut. This must be the man James had seen. He told them that it was a former factory that lost its license shortly after it was built and was abandoned. The man said that it worked as a covered storehouse for the components of the product. The original builder had kept it a secret. The suspect added that this setup inspired new uses for the building. After the neighborhood kids had spoken of a haunted mansion, a group of friends wanted to use it for personal enjoyment. But as they looked about and found the secret building, they realized it would be ideal for their crafty dealings. The man spilled everything in the interrogation room. He clarified that the equipment and the entire business are massive crypto farming operations. They appropriated energy and utilized it to run their storage computers and data mining equipment. He acknowledged that his responsibility throughout the operation was to examine the processor and ensure that it was working correctly. He was doing that when he saw James. He had packed everything up and tried his best to erase his fingerprints and the evidence. He stated that he hoped to relocate all the equipment to a more secure area and restart the operation. If an expert had been called in, he would have had a 24-hour window to act. Finding the other team members was simple. They possessed the majority of the proof. The authorities confiscated and repossessed all of their illegitimate gains after the case was heard in court. James received a front row seat and a commendation for discovering and reporting the issue.